she'll be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
No, whatever. We can fix that as long as you have a seat for her advisory group.
Yeah, we do.
In 2 minutes, or? Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We'll be starting in 2 minutes, so please take your seats. Please take your seats, and we're about to start. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends, boys and girls. I hope there are some. Thank you so much for joining our public dialogue meeting. This is the open public dialogue on the theme of addressing inequalities, which has been, as I think most of you know, a conversation that has been going on for the last several months worldwide, very much based on the website that the UN has co-facilitated with the Global Coalition Against Poverty. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, the co-leader together with myself. I'm Richard Morgan from UNICEF. My co-leader is Saraswati Menon, the Director of Policy at UN Women. Saras, I'm very pleased to have you with us. We've worked together over the last several months with strong support from two very important partners, the government of Denmark and the government of Ghana. And we're delighted to be here, hosted by the government of Denmark, and to have also with us a very strong team from the government of Ghana and the people of Ghana who are with us here in the room, including the director of the National Planning Commission of Ghana. So we're very grateful in the UN, UNICEF and UN Women, to the governments of Denmark and Ghana for making this consultation on addressing inequalities possible. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce, I think most of you here in Denmark at least know him, Christian Friisbach, the Minister for Development Cooperation of the Government of Denmark, and we're very grateful to him for his presence and invite him to say some words of welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome, and let me also welcome you all to Copenhagen and to this public dialogue meeting addressing inequalities in the post-2015 development agenda. It's encouraging to see the overwhelming interest here, participation. Very good to have you all here, and a warm welcome to those who also join online. Now, on behalf of the Danish government, I'm pleased to co-host it, and I would like to also extend my sincere appreciation to our co-host Ghana, and also to UNICEF, UN Women, strong partners who have organized the consultation. Thank you to the advisory group for their very good work, the valuable recommendations, the strong synthesis report, which is here for your disposal. There's a broad spectrum of inputs and ideas, and this vibrant and lively debate is very encouraging, and I look forward to the discussions today as well. Now, why a consultation on inequality? Well, because inequality is a key challenge to human development, and addressing it is a precondition for progress and sustainable and a sustainable future. The Millennium Development Goals have taken us far in addressing a number of critical development challenges, lifting millions of people out of poverty. However, there are significant gaps still there. Social exclusion, inequalities have not been sufficiently addressed in the framework we've had up to now. And the consequences are clear. Growing inequalities within many countries and between countries in the world. 1.3, 1.4 billion people still in extreme poverty. It's not acceptable. It has to be addressed in the future development agenda. Today, the discussion will focus on why inequalities matter, what are the factors that drive them, sustain them, how can we address inequalities. And when discussing this, it's important to notice, as the report says, it's closely linked to poverty. And like poverty, inequality is multidimensional. It has to do with social, economic, political, environmental dimensions. And therefore we need to have a holistic approach to addressing poverty and addressing inequality. Too often we have tried to address one type of inequality and then only see people being blocked by other types of inequality and discrimination. So you cannot do it with a clip of your fingers. There's a need for profound changes in politics and economics, in culture, in cooperation, in trust, in tolerance. The effects of inequalities are very real. They really affect millions of people, citizens in the world. They experience discrimination. They are pushed to the margins of their society. It often hits the poorest, the most vulnerable groups the most: children, women, indigenous people, refugees, internally displaced, disabled people, religious minorities. People are discriminated also on the basis of their sexual orientation. And often they are kept in an iron grip by long-standing structures and power relations in our societies. During my travels all over the world, I've met many young people. Young indigenous man in Bolivia, a young rural woman in Mozambique. They have exactly the same dreams as young people have here in Denmark. They want a good education, they want a job, they want a family, they want opportunities. But their possibilities to fulfill their dreams are definitely not the same. And therefore we must also focus on the right to a better life, equal opportunities, life in dignity and decency. And in doing this, the human rights aspects and perspectives are crucial. I believe human rights must form the backbone in our fight against poverty, inequality, and discrimination in all its dimensions. Respecting human rights, fighting discrimination, is essential for each and every individual, and it's important for building strong and inclusive societies based on equity and on participation. Discrimination is what excludes individuals from fulfilling their dreams, realizing their potentials. It blocks a society from prosperity. Now, the human rights framework is a comprehensive universal framework to address inequalities. Human rights have a strong potential to redistribute both wealth and power. And therefore, I believe it's crucial to ensure a closer link with human rights in a future development framework beyond 2015. Human rights should both inspire our future goals and it should inspire our path to get there. This can be done by building on core principles of universality, non-discrimination, participation, and accountability. As said, addressing inequality is indeed a multidimensional challenge. There's no silver bullet, no clips of your fingers, but it can be done. And that's the good news. Historic experiences, recent research shows us that inequalities can be tackled, and if you do so, it will create stronger and richer societies. It can contribute to economic growth. Now, this is good news, because for many years, the conventional wisdom, when I studied in university economics in the beginning and taught it as well, the conventional wisdom was that we should have larger inequality, or a certain level of inequality at least was necessary in order to promote growth, because it gave wealthier people more opportunities to save and invest. It provided incentives for people to do an extra effort when there were inequalities in a society. Now today, economists and research and I believe it's exactly the opposite. Equality can promote savings, and poor people all over the world have showed so. In China, poor peasant farmers have high savings rates and use it to invest in their communities. The argument that inequality is necessary to create incentives has also been turned around, because if you have facing large inequalities and discrimination, your dream becomes too distant, too difficult, and it will discourage people instead of inspiring them. So equality can all create more economic growth, a more dynamic society. Also because the primary way of redistribution in many poor countries is investments in education and health. It makes people smarter, healthier, it increases social capital to the benefit of companies and growth, it increases social cohesion, reduces conflict in a society. A more equitable society can give poor people hope for a better future, a real possibility of participation in creating wealth and prosperity. It can make better use of capital with more equitable societies, and it can spur innovation. Now, this morning on the way here, when I woke up, I saw this piece of toy. It's in my bedroom. I bought it 15 years ago to my kids, and they played with it, and it still holds. And it's very advanced, you know. Everything moves when it drives. And I really enjoy having this piece of toy in my bedroom, because every morning I look at it, and many mornings I look at it, and I think, imagine, you know, I bought it in Zambia or Zimbabwe, I can't remember, 15 years ago. But imagine if this guy, he had gotten a good education and he had become an engineer. This guy, he could have created miracles. You know, this is a very complex thing, and it's very doable, and it's very well made. And he probably didn't fulfill any of his potentials because he didn't get the same possibilities as he would have gotten if he was in Denmark. We lose enormous potentials around in the world by not investing in people, by not giving them equal opportunities. So how do we do it then? Well, remove discriminatory barriers that block girls and women, young people, poor people, marginalized groups is crucial. Way too often, poor people, marginalized groups stumble into rules and regulations, obstacles and oppression, barriers and blockages in their aspiration for a better life. These barriers must be removed, one by one, all by all. Explicit measures, increased awareness to provide equal access and opportunity for all is crucial. Investing, as I said, in education and health is key elements in fighting inequality. Economists shows us this is very efficient in doing so. But the challenge to do better is still there. It's there in Denmark, it's there in Afghanistan, it's there in Ghana, it's there in Brazil. There's a need for hardcore economic redistributive measures to redistribute welfare and income. A progressive tax system is necessary. That's also what economists will tell us. That's the experience in Denmark. And then there's a strong need for building social safety nets. A number of countries have taken a different path. Instead, they have tried to redistribute by means of subsidies for energy and food. I don't believe this is the right remedy. Not only can they create unsustainable growth patterns in terms of natural resource depletion, climate change, but they are not very effective in promoting equality. Studies by the World Bank have shown that if you instead promote reduce poverty and promote equality by building social safety nets, you can do it by perhaps 1/4 of the money that you use on subsidies for energy and food. It's more targeted, it's more efficient. And more countries, encouraging enough, are building social safety nets. Everything from health insurance in Ghana to the Bolsa Familias in Brazil, the Oportunidades in Mexico, the Child Support Grant in South Africa, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, in Ethiopia, the food safety net. Social safety nets are crucial to make sure that people do not fall out the bottom of our society and that we tackle extreme poverty and inequality. So to sum up, the good news is that increased equity can create stronger societies, viable societies. It can create growth and opportunities. And the good news is also that we can tackle equality. Look at countries around the world, vast experiences. There's no kind of golden rule that with globalization we will all turn into unequal societies in the end. No, it is determined by political choices and by daring political leaders who stand forward and tackle inequality. That's how it can be done. And the good news is that, as said, that if countries do it, if countries fight inequality, they are rewarded by increased stability, innovation, inclusive economic growth to the benefit of all. So with this, I wish you a good debate today. It will be an important part. It's the first of these global consultation. It will provide us a lot of input, a lot of inspiration, a number of good ideas on how we can take this important agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think we're going to need to go to Southern Africa to find these toys, some other models and examples. We're very grateful for the substantive introduction by Minister Christian Friesbach, and in a way it's going to make our job a little bit easier because the Minister has already covered many of the points that I think have come from the report. I'm going to turn over just in a moment to Saras for the introduction on the report. before we go to the interactive panels, which will take up the rest of the day. But I want to say just one word about the process that we have worked for and lived and experienced over the past several months to come to this point where I think we have a very substantive analysis and set of ideas and recommendations to feed into the discussions around what comes after 2015 for the international agenda. We couldn't have done this literally without our advisory group. And most of the members of the advisory group were able to travel here to Copenhagen for the meeting. They're sitting in the first 2 rows, most of them. I want to thank all of you. And the good thing is I don't need or have to introduce the members of the advisory group now because they will be forming the panels over the next few hours, the 3 panels that we have scheduled. So you'll meet them, everybody one by one, as members of the panel up here a bit later in the day. But I want to say on behalf of Saras and myself, without you, we couldn't have come this far. I also want to thank in particular Charlotte Holland. There's the one person I am going to single out. Charlotte is there, and we very... I was trying to think of the right metaphor. What I will explain to you is that we have had almost 1,400 written submissions over the last several months for this consultation. 1,400 contributors, as well as about 4,000 people using the site over the last several months. So Charlotte, I think, has read all of these 1,400, as well as 175 submissions in the form of research papers, analytical papers, and personal testimony from people around the world who are affected by and living these problems that the Minister referred to of inequalities, of discrimination, exclusion, marginalization for one reason or another. Now, Charlotte has taken all of these ingredients and somehow baked a very rich and appetizing cake, I think, that's the metaphor I wanted to use, and done that in a very short space of time. So just wanted to acknowledge the excellent support and work that Charlotte has done for us and with us in the advisory group. The final thing I want to say before handing over to Saras is that for many of us, for me and I think for Saras and others, we hope this is but a starting point. We don't regard this conversation, this process, this discussion around the issue of inequalities as having reached any kind of conclusion simply because a report has been produced and will be discussed and debated and presented here in Denmark today and tomorrow with our colleagues from Denmark and Ghana and all around the world. Rather, we hope this is the beginning of a global focus on those people who are most left behind in human progress, on the reasons why so many people are still left behind and excluded, and what can be done about it in the short term, because it's urgent, in the medium term, as new generations are born and grow up, and in the longer term, where we have to get the balance right between human progress and safeguarding our planet and our natural resources. So the issue of inequalities we don't think is going away. We hope we have helped the discussion and the focus on inequalities and how to tackle them to get started, but it's only begun. We have to find ways to continue this discussion, continue this work, and talk to our leaders and decision makers around the world and find out what they're going to do and how they will be held accountable for what they do in relation to inequalities. So I would like to hand over to Saras, who's going to take you through some of the main issues that came out of the discussions over the last several months and that are contained in the report. And after that, we will go to our interactive panel sessions. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me? I'll bring it closer. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I almost have to pinch myself to believe we've made it to Copenhagen after all the months of consultation. And we're really delighted to be here and to see so many faces in the room. Because what Richard has described, this broad-based consultation process, continues even today and will continue in the future. And so it's really very important for us to be here with all of you. I know that all of you have read the report, and I think the Minister has also expressed a lot of the spirit within the report very clearly to all of you. So I'm just going to dwell on 8 points that we really want to highlight. And the first is, and this struck us very much in listening to the voices and reading the papers and the submissions that were made, that objectively we know that inequalities exist, that they have been growing in many cases, both within countries, between countries, and so on. But what came through was that this is not just an objective phenomenon, but subjectively, people feel very strongly about inequalities, and that the kind of movements we've seen across the last few months and also what we heard, people don't want this to continue, and they want something done about it. And I think this is a very central message of this whole process, not just of the report, that people are tired of seeing things worsen, or even when they improve, as was mentioned earlier, they improve on one track but not on others, and that this cannot continue. The second point, which was also made earlier, but I really want to reiterate this, is that inequalities, this came through very clearly, inequalities diminish the lives of all people, not just those who are most deprived or those who are most vulnerable or those who are poorest. Of course, they are deeply affected, and dealing with inequalities means dealing with their issues first and looking at the world through their eyes. But it goes much further than that. Discrimination poisons an entire society. It poisons the way you function within a community. It poisons your relationship with others in your community and your society. It poisons the perception of that society in the rest of the world. We know the impact that inequality has had on savings, was mentioned, on growth, on economic progress. Holding back the talents and skills of people affects the potential that a society has. Without full political participation or representation or voice, the polity itself is damaged and never fully responds to the needs of everyone there within the society. So in essence, the impact that inequalities have, and which I think we've only touched upon in this report, is something that every country needs to explore further to look at how it poisons or diminishes the lives of everyone. The third point I want to make is that, as in many other reports, we've talked about national inequalities and we've talked about inequalities between and among countries, and how a certain international regime actually fosters the inequalities between countries and, in fact, fosters inequalities within countries, because it's the international framework of trade, of politics, of negotiations that actually have an impact even within countries. But I think what the report brings out very clearly is that there are also similar patterns of inequalities across all countries. So you find issues of race, issues of gender inequality, issues of disability, which touch all countries. They may express themselves differently within a national context, but they are common and shared problems. And being shared, it means that the way we address inequality in any future framework, this means that it has to be a universal approach. It has to be universal not just because of the solidarity we need among countries, but beyond that, because every country needs to address this problem. I think we've also tried in the report to capture where progress has been made. And there are many cases where progress has been made. But many inequalities have worsened. And the recognition of this worsening is an issue, again, that needs to be studied, explored further. We have only touched the tip of the iceberg. And I think the framing that we have used in the report that emerged from the discussions will help us understand what worsening actually means. Does it mean just depth? Does it mean reinforcement across inequalities? And this, again, is something that needs to be analyzed within each country. The fifth point I want to make relates to why inequalities persist. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, there are structural barriers to overcoming inequality. And these relate to every domain of human life. Just to give you a few examples, we have looked at economic, social, environmental, and political domains in the report. If you look at the economic domain, how wealth or assets are distributed in a society expresses itself in inequalities. And some of the issues of control of assets actually are very, very deep-rooted, and they are regenerated by the economic system, by economic policies and so on, and these have to be tackled head-on. In the social sphere, inequalities leads to denying groups their rights, and in turn translates into discriminatory practices which are very deeply embedded in a culture and in a society. Overcoming these requires, again, very careful attention. In the environmental sphere, we see the vulnerability to climate change of countries, not just individual groups of people, but of countries. The vulnerability to disaster, particularly of certain populations within countries. I mean, these are issues that have to be tackled when dealing with inequality. And finally, when we talk about politics, and it's more than just politics, it's also justice, it's access to justice, it's a question of representation, question of voice. These are all tracks on which there are structural barriers to achieving inequality. What we also find when you start looking at what lies beneath inequalities, is that these structural barriers reinforce each other, and that these different forms of discrimination along different tracks reinforce each other and actually lead to very unique situations of discrimination. And this is, again, something that has to be taken into account. I'm just going to give you an example, because we cannot in this time, and we'll have a lot of time to discuss further, look at what happens when inequalities reinforce each other, and how they express themselves in a very particular sense. And so my sixth point relates to looking not at all the issues I would have liked to discuss, like that of disabled, indigenous people, LGBTI people, and so on, but I'm taking gender inequality as an example. And when we looked at that from all the submissions we had, and we had several online discussions, e-discussions on gender equality and also related issues, the four structural issues that were identified were, the first was the lower or lesser control of social, economic, and political resources and opportunities. And this applies across the board in all countries. The second, which is, I think, a key one, is the cultural and social reproduction of the subordinate status of women and girls in every society. And sometimes, and it is interesting to note this, sometimes it's not just a cultural phenomenon, but it is also state-sponsored, because it's also reflected in the public participation or the political participation of women and their voice. The third is the failure to ensure women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this goes to the heart of choice and decision-making for women and girls. And the fact that this persists is actually a structural basis for inequality. And finally, the fourth that was identified again, and perhaps because we had a specific e-discussion on this, is gender-based violence, the most prevalent form of violation of human rights. So let me, for a seventh point, just quickly touch, because already so much was already said, on this question of tackling inequalities. I think from this framing of the issue of how to address inequalities, it is clear that whatever is done cannot be done piecemeal. And we have tried to give examples. Many examples were brought to our attention, many studies were provided of progress that has been made in countries. And where this progress was, was underpinned or stood on many legs of policy change or policy, there was real transformation. But where it was a single initiative trying to address a single track of discrimination or a single form of inequality, it was really not sustainable, because the reinforcing nature of different inequalities then, of course, as was said earlier, pushed the society or the progress backwards. So there are two issues I really want to underline here, that when we looked at inequalities, and from this universalist perspective, obviously anything that needs to be done, whether it is the provision of social services, public services, and so on, the underlying premise is that there should be universal access. And the outcomes of that universal access must be measured in terms of everybody's outcome, not just an average or not just the section that is easiest to reach. But when you look at inequalities that have led to discriminatory practices, have led to even blindness on the part of public policy and of the state, then this, in order to achieve universality, very specific measures have to be taken. Temporary special measures have to be introduced, affirmative action has to be introduced in order to overcome these barriers which have held people back. And the other point that I really want to underline is that to measure this change, to measure progress, we have to look for transformational change. It's not enough to look again that some progress was made here, more women have been employed, and therefore they have access to some resources and assets. This leads to better decision-making. They can walk away from abusive relationships. So there is some progress. But in the entire picture, if the conditions of work are below human, then you've not really addressed the issue of gender inequality. So it must, your look at the progress has to be based on transformational change. And finally, which is why we are here, looking at the framework that is being proposed on the basis of all the submissions that were made, the report is fairly clear that the principles of equality, human rights, and sustainability are critical. We are not only talking about this generation, although we want change now. We are talking about future generations and the planet as it serves us and as we serve the planet. So we are looking forward. So any framework cannot be short-term. We are basing it on principles of human rights, because that's why we are concerned with equality, because it's fairness and justice are critical, and therefore the approaches must be based on human rights. We here in the report, we are proposing that there be a specific goal in any new framework on inequalities, but also, and this I think is the most important part, all other goals must have targets and indicators on the most important priorities to address inequality. And in developing these targets, we are looking for zero discrimination. Nothing short of that is satisfactory. We are looking for disaggregation when we monitor, so that we can see what happens to all people. We are looking for ways in which the indicators can be weighted, so that again we can give higher priority to achieving equality than was given before. And above all, of course, we are looking for a universal framework that applies to all countries, that captures the interconnectedness of inequalities, not just within a country, but among countries, so that we really track policy action, global, regional, international, in terms of what it does to people and what it does to people in many other countries. And we are looking for a framework that provides the basis for accountability, so that people can hold their governments accountable, people can hold their governments accountable for what they do, not only within their own state, but what their governments do to other states, to people in other countries. And in this, I'm really very pleased, we are very pleased that we have, throughout this discussion, very clearly heard the voices of civil society. And we are also so pleased that the leaders are willing to listen to these voices, because accountability will only be served if leaders are transparent about what they're doing, publish openly the information on whether progress is being made or progress is not being made, and if the voice of civil society is continuously raised to hold their leaders and themselves accountable. Because a framework in itself is not accountable. A mechanism itself is not accountable. It's the use that's made of all this. So if leaders and civil society don't use it, we don't find accountability. So let me just say thank you very much for coming here. We are very happy that we are sort of concluding this entire process at this point with a public dialogue and with a leadership meeting where these voices will be heard and the leaders will pronounce and also commit, I expect, to what they will do. And I hope that with the leadership meeting and with the outcome of that tomorrow, we will return to a public dialogue by the leaders within their countries and by all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saras. And I'm very pleased that we are on time. From what I see in the clock at the back there, we have about 1 minute, so I just wonder whether the Minister, would you like to say a parting word at all before? No, it's good? You're good, okay. Thank you very much. So what I would like to do now is invite our first panel, our members of our first panel here to the podium, and we will introduce them. Well, as I said, you'll have the chance to meet all the members of the advisory group who had managed to be here in Copenhagen, and this is the first group. The theme of this interactive panel is around a couple of framing questions. And we want to concentrate, to some extent at least, in the next hour and a quarter on these questions. Why do inequalities matter? Why do we care about inequalities at all? So that would be the first question. And part of the reason we think they matter is because of the impacts that they have for societies and individuals. So we want to ask the question, not only why do inequalities matter, but because of what impacts, what are the impacts they have for different people and countries around the world. Let me introduce our panel. First of all, we have from the Danish Institute for International Studies, Lars Pedersen. I hope my pronunciation is not too bad. Tak skal du have. Dzodzi Tsikata from the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research of the University of Ghana. So, most welcome to Dzodzi, who has come a long way, of course, further than last. On this side, we have Alex Cobham from Save the Children. Rosa Lizard, there at the end. Rosa is from the Feminist Task Force of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Here on my left is Tina Chang from the Catholic Institute for Overseas Development, CAFOD, also representing the Beyond 2015 coalition, which is a network of, I think, about 500 organizations around the world now, Beyond 2015. So welcome to Tina. And Nicole Bidegen from Dawn, which is Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era. So Nicole, most welcome. So what we decided to do was to invite any of our panelists who wanted to say a few remarks at the beginning to do so. And we're going to ask Alex, Zotzi, Lars, and Nicole to say a few remarks on this theme and related issues first. They'll take about 5 minutes each or less, and then we will start to take questions, both from those of you here in the audience today in Copenhagen and also online. So let me start with Alex to give some initial remarks on the theme.
Thank you, Richard. I think I've got the short straw here because I would defy anyone to follow that great summary from Saras with any explanation of why inequalities matter. If that's not already completely clear, then there is little to do than read the report. But I do want to pull out a few of the findings of the report in terms of the impacts on societies and individuals. We're probably all familiar, or a great many of us will be, with the research in this area. And at the beginning of this consultation process, as well as now. So we know the results around the way that inequality reduces the prospects for long-term stable growth, the way that inequalities lead to conflicts, the way that inequalities undermine social outcomes, whether that's in terms of health, in terms of the rule of law, in terms of educational achievements, and so on, in terms of crime. We probably also know the research around the impact on individuals. There's a great deal of work in the report, including some from Save the Children, some from the Young Lives researchers in Oxford, which is particularly powerful, looking at the way that inequalities as experienced by children affect not only their immediate intellectual achievement, but over time, their intellectual, their psychosocial progress, and indeed their economic achievement. The report's also clear that the distinction between inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity is largely a false one. That unless we have some perfect system in which the inequality of the generation of parents has no impact on average on the achievements of the generation of children, then the outcome inequality of parents becomes the opportunity inequality of children. And one of the striking statistics in the report is that where if you compare the income per person in the top 10% and the bottom 10% of households, looking across 32 countries, you find a ratio of 17 to 1. But if you look at the income per child in those households, that ratio doubles. It's a ratio of 35 to 1. So the inequalities with which children are beginning their lives, which then affect their prospects, not only for education, for healthcare, but also, as the research shows, their psychosocial development, then we are building from the start a basis for underachievement socially and for personal damage to a great many of each generation that comes through. But the consultation hasn't just been a survey of the research. It has been participative and indeed political. And arguably, that's the more important thing that comes out of this. I think when we began looking at this process, and I include my own organisation in this, some people felt that it might be too difficult, too politically charged to achieve in the post-2015 framework a separate goal on inequality. And as a result, we put a lot of emphasis on the importance, which is vital, of disaggregated indicators and targets across all of the other goals. But I think what's become clear through this consultation is that the overwhelming sense, politically speaking, is that there must be a goal on inequality as well as disaggregated data, targets, indicators throughout the other goals. And that's enormously welcome, and I'm very pleased that that Save the Children has also adopted that position. There's one particular area that I want to pull out where you can see in the last couple of months how the politics of some of this has really changed, and that's around tax. Now, as you see from the report, tax is not a silver bullet. On its own, a fair and just tax system will not solve all of the inequality we face, but it is an enormously powerful tool or set of tools. And for as long as we continue to allow an international system that fails to count the wealth of individuals and the profits of companies, the prospects for individual countries, or indeed globally, having a tax system that is just, that can do the kind of redistribution that we need to see if we are to challenge the structural inequalities on the economic side that we face, but also the related political and social and ultimately environmental inequalities that are linked to them. We need to be looking very carefully at this. And what's been so encouraging in the last couple of months is we've seen some of the most conservative political leaders around the world suddenly embracing this agenda on change, embracing exactly the things that are in the consultation report, and calling for the kind of transparency from tax havens, from companies, that we need to make that challenge. I'll finish there, but I hope you feel as optimistic as I do at the end of, as Richard says, the first part only of this process of thinking about inequalities in post-2015. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I would draw everybody's attention to an excellent report that came out a month ago by Save the Children called Ending Poverty in Our Generation, which puts forward many proposals for the post-2015 agenda. Tsotsi is our next speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk about why inequalities matter and what impacts they have for societies and individuals. And I thought that given the excellent reports that we have and all the issues that have already been discussed, I would focus on why inequalities are important to a country like Ghana. I want to start by saying that Ghana is not a poster child of an equal society. Far from it. However, some of Ghana's early post-independence efforts to address inequalities, regional inequalities between North and Southern Ghana, class and gender inequalities, and also its more recent experience of growth and poverty reduction offer lessons, both positive and negative, for dealing with the growing inequalities in income, access to productive resources, to basic social needs, to power and to decision-making across the world. And I was especially mindful of Saras's point that inequalities have similar patterns across countries. Other African countries also offer lessons we should pay attention to. For example, two of the most successful countries in Africa in terms of GDP growth, South Africa and Botswana, are also two of the most unequal, using the Gini coefficient as a measure. Inequalities matter in so many ways, large and small, and they have ramifications for all who experience them, also for those who do not experience them, and for society at large. For a developing country such as Ghana, inequalities are a critical issue because they are actually often a matter of life and death. Inequality is that 50-kilometer muddy corrugated feeder road on which a pregnant woman in rural Ghana has to travel on a hand-pushed truck to the nearest health post. And that health post uses a kerosene lamp at night and has no running water and has only one nurse. For the woman, it could mean dying in childbirth. For her husband, remaining children and wider family, the loss of a provider and a nurturer. For her country, the sad waste of human resources, and another statistic for maternal mortality rates. Inequalities matter because they deprive wide sections of society of their citizenship and their future. And by citizenship, I'm not talking about legal status, but about the everyday practice of life. In Ghana, this is manifested in the distance from and lack of access to the institutions established to address precisely the socioeconomic needs of people. The banks, basic social services such as education, water, sanitation, health, housing, and energy. It is manifest in the lack of productive resources, in being trapped in precarious forms of work, sometimes with no pay, and sometimes only payment in kind, and distance from governance and decision-making bodies. Inequalities matter because they threaten national cohesion and they create insecurity, and are an important factor in the violent conflicts in, for example, Marikana in South Africa, the land troubles in Zimbabwe, in election violence in Kenya. Closer to home in Ghana, inequalities are creating a fertile ground for communal conflict, for violent crime, for patronage and corruption, and they result in the loss of credibility of state institutions. And they matter because they do not self-correct. Instead, they perpetuate, they reproduce over generations and cumulate and combine to create systematic disadvantages for certain groups and individuals. And these groups have already been mentioned: rural dwellers, poor urban dwellers, people in certain occupations such as small-scale farming, people living in certain regions and ecological zones, groups such as women, youth, children, persons with disability, the old and infirm, and persons of minority sexualities. It is for all these reasons and many more offered by other panelists this morning that we need to pay attention to inequalities in the post-2015 development agenda. No matter how difficult it is, and we've heard it's difficult, we do have to tackle inequalities as our duty to ourselves and to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsotsi. And I think you can see already why we've been so fortunate in our advisory group members. Let me request Lars to give some comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When we started these consultations 6-7 months ago, I was quite skeptical whether the issue of inequality actually could mobilize support. I think I fear that, or at that time, I really had a fear whether this could change and gain political support. I think inequalities have characterized human societies since time immemorial. Only on rare occasions it has been possible to address them and do something about them. The normal situation is that inequalities are accepted by rulers and ruled alike. But times are changing, I think, and notably with the globalization penetrating almost all corners of social life, and in particular information and communication technologies and the social media, with them we can now see that information about acts of injustice is spread very rapidly and to very many people. We've seen it recently in India, and we've seen it in the Middle East, where acts of injustice have mobilized millions of people and forced authorities to address these issues and the underlying inequalities. So this is a major change, I think, in the world that we live in today compared to earlier times, and that may give some hope for addressing inequalities. Moreover, I think, as we have heard, it may be now that those benefiting from inequalities may no longer do so in a sustainable manner. One thing is that social stability and economic development are associated with reduced inequalities. At the recent economic summit in Davos in Switzerland, inequalities were identified as the major threat to stability. So there is an increased recognition of this problem. Moreover, I think it is important to state that the collective good of societies is best achieved if all individuals actually can realize their own potential. When girls don't go to school, they are not the only ones to suffer. Society as such loses talent, entrepreneurs, qualified labor. So it's a loss to everyone, including those who benefit in the immediate, in the short run from these inequalities. And then finally, I think that the inequalities are growing, notably at the global level. The global disparities in income and wealth are gigantic and cannot be defended in any reasonable manner with respect to or with reference to competence or effort or something like that. It is a situation that cannot be defended any longer. So we may actually have a situation now for the first time in the history of mankind where we can do something seriously about those inequalities blocking the hopes and endeavors of millions of people. The 21st century may become the moment in history where humanism finally prevails. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lars. Very potent arguments, and I think if I can just add something to that very quickly. To me, this has been a learning experience in many ways. One is to understand a little bit the distinction between poverty, including extreme poverty as an issue, and inequalities as a related but distinct issue. It's not the same thing. You don't solve inequalities only by eradicating poverty or extreme poverty. There are other ways in which you would have to act as well, which are distinct. Let me ask Nicole to give the last of the first series of interventions from the panel, and then we will go to our other panelists a little bit later in the session after some questions. So, Nicole?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for your comment, because my reflections go in that direction. So why inequalities matter? For me, it really matters because they're an indicator of a deeper structural problems. From one side, they are the consequence of a system of production that subordinates the care and the well-being of people to private accumulation of profits and also cause severe ecological impacts. On the other side, inequalities are also the consequence of a system based on a hierarchicized power relations, based not just on economics, but also on historical long-length identities and characteristics, such as gender, class, race, age, sexual orientation, caste, ethnicity, abilities. So for me, these are the hard and complex political issues that should be addressed around inequality debate. These structural problems should be challenged if we want to overcome the root causes of inequalities and not just the symptoms. I think also talking about inequalities is talking about maldistribution. It's not just talking at the bottom of the distribution, but how access and power is distributed also in the top. So during the last 30 years, financial and trade liberalization, labor market deregulation, and cutbacks in social services produced an even more unequal distribution, wherein resources were channeled from the poor and concentrated to the rich. Therefore, levels of profit, private accumulation, and consumption increased for certain groups, while the human rights of the majority of women and men were not fulfilled. Also, I think it's very important that we discuss this relation between growth and inequalities. And we have literature in both sides saying, for instance, that some studies have even affirmed that in some cases, gender-based wage inequality was a stimulus for economic growth. So it's important to break the global race to the bottom to ensure that structural inequalities among genders, race, or even migration status are not exploited as an incentive for profit generation. Also, I think inequalities matter from an ethical point of view, not just because of social cohesion or because of benefit for growth, but it's an ethical justice, redistribution justice issue. And also inequalities hinder the fair distribution among social groups of the social or economic gains that can be collectively produced. Therefore, inequalities diminish the poverty reduction potential of some economic growth strategies. And just to finish, I would like to share 3 examples about how structural inequalities are conceived from a feminist perspective. Firstly, regarding the inequality in distribution of productive assets within society means that some economic actors, like multinational corporations, have control over resources such as land, technology, credits, while others actors, such as small women farmers, don't. So in some cases, we have seen that small farmers and women have even displaced, risking their food security because of the expansion of agribusiness. So we need to think in this relational way of tackling inequalities. Inequalities in distribution of care and domestic work within society is worsening girls' and women's opportunities to access to education and lifelong learning opportunities, paid work, equal wage, leisure time, political and community participation. Also, global care trends imply a care drain from developing countries to developed countries. Finally, the structure of constraint for women's rights and LGBTI people to exercise their sexual and reproductive rights is a core element of gender inequalities, as Sarawati was saying before. The fact that men still control women's and girls' body and police them through all forms of violence against women, girls, and LGBT people is a gross violence of their human rights. So sexual and reproductive rights is a basis for women, girls, and LGBT people, bodily autonomy and social empowerment. I think these three examples are clear for us about what is the framework that we really want to push in this discussion. And finally, to quote what the Ministry of Development and Cooperation says, Christian Frisch-Bath, inequalities can be tackled, and it's just a question of political will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And again, thank you to Alex, Zozi, and Lars. We'll come back to our other two panelists a little bit later, Rosa and Tina, and give you the same opportunity. But let me hand over to Saras as co-facilitator for the session to open up for the discussion.
Thank you, Richard. We've had 4 very interesting presentations. What we are going to do is open it up for 5 comments from the floor, and then I will ask 2 of the panelists, whoever gets their hand up first, to respond to those 5. And then we'll go back to the online, because I think we have several questions online as well. So who would like to take the floor first? Please, could you come to the mic? Could you please introduce yourself, and please don't take more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Vagn Bertelsen. I'm Secretary General of EBIS, a Danish NGO. Thank you to the panelists, and I'm so happy that you were all making an optimistic note about getting inequality as one of the post-millennium development goals in there. Could I ask you, if you, and Alec was addressing the political sensibility about this, do you think it is possible also further down the line discussing targets and indicators to address specifically issues of illicit capital flight and tax havens? And it's appropriate to say this. I would say also that this process is co-led by Ghana and Denmark, and Ghana has very recently, after years and years of depletion of gold resources, introduced a windfall tax. And measures like that are necessary and important. But do you think this could, something like this could be introduced as target and indicators head-on in this process? Thank you.
Somebody else? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. This is a new way for the Occupy movement. I think I took the mic. My name is Stig Langvad. I'm the chairperson of DPOD, which is the umbrella organization of persons with disabilities in Denmark. But I'm also a member of the committee under the UNCRPD. I think that having read all the documents to this conference, to this gathering, I can see that there is a growing recognition of the fact that persons with disabilities need to be tackled in a specific way, needs to be much higher on the agenda. But having said that, I still think that there is a need, or rather I propose I should perhaps ask the panel whether you agree with me that there is a need for looking upon inequality for specific groups in different ways and tackling the challenges in different ways. For my understanding and my reading, I can see that every time that we take initiatives, the majority of those that are left behind are persons with disabilities. We are the most unemployed, we are the less represented, we are belonging to the poorest of the poor. Among women with disabilities, we find more violence than among women in general. So I would rather that we sometimes took away our very broad perspective and sometimes focus on the specific needs of specific minorities, because it is sometimes a matter of affirmative action to be sure that you can get into the labor market, that you can be focused in international cooperation, etc., etc. And I think that we need indicators that really shows that among those that are the 20% left behind, that the proportion of those are containing less and less persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Harsh Mandra. I'm from India. I just thought that I'd like to focus a little more on equality and said something about the ethical imperative for addressing inequality. And I think that's, if you look at the last 30 years or so, when you look around in the world, there's one question about whether objectively inequalities have grown or reduced. But for me, the more worrying and the more important question is that what has happened to the normative framework within which inequalities occur? And is there, in the world today, a much greater sense that, a normative framework which looks at inequality as acceptable or unacceptable? And just within my own lifetime, I see a huge change really in the normative framework in which inequality is looked at. And the last 30 years with neoliberal economic policies and their spread in most governments, the sense that we need to, young people are being brought up to believe that they have to give up the socialist guilt of the past, and it's okay to consume and to think more and more about yourself to the exclusion of others. And a sense of greater social solidarities with your parents telling you, don't waste food because they're hungry children outside, and so on. I believe that the normative framework in which inequality is located has transformed dramatically. And that is, until we address that, inequalities will not get relieved.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take off from the earlier, sorry. My name is Asaf Bekele from the African Child Policy Forum. I'd like to take off from one of the interventions that was made earlier on the issue of people with disabilities. I'd like to sort of raise it in a general context. One of the problems we have, both in articulating global positions of the kind that we're trying to do, and at the same time ensuring their practical application at the national level, is that you're forced to make general statements. For example, saying that national policy should address the issue of vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, and so on and But on the other hand, that statement happens to be so big, so general, that you tend to ignore the ones that need particular attention. Let's take, for example, two groups, two categories, socioeconomic groups. One is the case of children without parental care. Now, children without parental care can constitute a huge part of the population. If you took Africa, for example, they may constitute as many as the population of South Africa, Namibia, Swaziland, Botswana combined together. It is that big. So and these kinds of children suffer from all kinds of deprivation and from all kinds of exploitation, abuse, violence, and so on. So if you sort of left national or international declarations by saying that you should address the situation of vulnerable children, they more or less disappear from the policy radar. The same with, for example, persons with disabilities or children with disabilities. If you take some, it's not exact, it's not precise, but if you take some UNICEF statistics and research that we have carried out in our center, you find that children with a disability may constitute as many as 1/3 or 1/4 of the population in some countries. Different kinds of disabilities. And they certainly need particular attention. Now, if you therefore articulated an international position or a national position by saying we should pay attention to vulnerable children, my worry is that the ones that really need serious policy attention may disappear from the policy radar. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we come up with a position that at one level universalizes, generalizes the issues that we'd like to address, but on the other hand, we also would want to make sure that particular attention is given to particular groups of children. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A last comment from the floor in this round? Please, at the back.
Assistant Prof at Metropolitan University College in Copenhagen. My question, and first of all, thanks to the panelists, my question is, and also a comment that this report, which concerns inequalities, also states that economic growth is affected when there are inequalities both within and between countries. Economic growth, however, is often equated with development. And my concern is this kind of economic growth that is being emphasized all over the globe in terms of neoliberal globalization, free trade, and so on, is actually exacerbating inequalities. So how do we reconcile this notion of economic growth and increasing inequalities? In India, for instance, people's lands are being taken away in the name of constructing special SEZ, special economic zones, free trade zones, etc. So that is a concern because the framework for human rights that we have adopted so far is really focusing on governments and states to enforce those human rights. We're not holding corporations or businesses accountable to human rights. Although the UN, I believe in 2011, had a guiding principle or guiding framework for business and human rights, but it's not being enforced. So how do we reconcile these two as a comment?
Thank you very much. We've had 5 very interesting questions, and if I could just quickly summarize, we've had 2 which relate to patterns of economic growth, how they're translated, and how in indicators do you actually capture some of the elements of globalization, such as illicit capital flight and so on. We've had 2 questions on the translation of universal frameworks into policy action that makes a difference with specific reference to groups, disabled people, children in particular situations. And we've had 1 question on the ethical shifts actually, in the ethical framework of the way people act and what, in the socialization process. So I'm inviting two of the panelists to respond to any or all of these questions. Who would like to start? Did I scare you off? Well, Lars.
I wouldn't like to answer all these questions because, but I would like to just make a point on this about the normative framework, because I think that's quite interesting, and I think it's key to whether we have a chance or we don't have a chance with this agenda right now. And I think I would like to say that I think that I recognize what you describe, the individualization and the consumer. The consumerism in the world. But on the other hand, I think that may also, to some extent, help this discussion, because everyone wants to have a fair share of this world and the goods in the world. So inequalities, they actually become important to everybody, even though there's little solidarity. Secondly, I think that the way to address inequalities may not be through solidarity. It may more be through vulnerable groups actually addressing these issues themselves and making them heard politically, so that they get their rights fulfilled and get a better share, or fairer share of the goods. So in that sense, I'm not certain that whether what you describe is a problem for addressing or for taking up this issue. I think the other, just one more comment, namely about the relationship between general issues and pinpointing the problems of specific groups. In the report, I think a very good attempt has been made to make that balance. Evidently, it would be very good, but also very difficult in the future post-2015 development goals to look much more into details of specific groups. But it is certainly difficult if we, at the same time, want to have a set of simple goals that can mobilize a lot of attention globally. So it's a balance, but I think it is very important, and it has been recognized in the report that balance has to be struck.
Next, Nika.
I really appreciate the last comment, because I think when we talk about inequalities, growth, they're very contentious concepts, and depending who is speaking, depending what understand about it. And yes, from our position, economic growth is not equal to development or economic growth, and it's not an end itself. So the real discussion is what kind of economic growth and to what certain levels, and how we balance the north and south dimension of this. And so what kind of economic growth is really not depleting the planet, and it's really job intensive. And also what kind of structural policies should change in the market labors, for instance, to tackle informality, and women also benefit from this kind of job creation. I think this should be a really important point for the post-2015 development debate, because otherwise we are just talking about very few things and not the structural ones. So also discussing about what kind of growth for what kind of development process, it's linked with the discussion about rules at the global level, and what kind of rule we have to change in trade, in debt, in finance, and how UN is engaging in these debates. So it's kind of contradictory if governments, for instance, government from the OECD that are pushing the post-2015 development agenda discussion and online consultations, wants that we discuss a development agenda without talking about economy, and without talking or leaving this discussion for other forums like G20, or we think we should discuss this within the UN, and because otherwise we get lost speaking only about small goals and indicators if we're not talking the structural problems that impede the realization, for instance, of the UN agendas of the 90s. So this is a really good question, because I think if we don't talk about the means of implementations and what are the structural factors that impede the human rights realization for everybody, we are just playing a game, in a sense. So, yes, for us, issues like changes in the global financial and trade rules are really key for the global for development agenda. The issue of progressive taxation and hold multinational and accountable for human rights, it's a really key. We continue prioritizing the state. I mean, it's the state who should hold accountable. For instance, the North government should hold accountable their corporations, taking, for instance, instrument of extraterritorial rights and obligations of these groups. And yes, for us, this is really a key issue. Otherwise, we are just talking about some development cooperation help that will not tackle the structural problem.
Thank you. Since the questions were so good, we're going to go to a third panelist.
It's downhill all the way from here. There are kind of three groups of questions in there. The first one on norms. I think we perhaps haven't spoken enough up here about the importance of this process in changing norms and perhaps in establishing some of the norms that have changed or are changing. So we talked about the extent to which inequality is more accepted at some level than perhaps it was, and the extent to which growth and development are elided in a way that makes it very difficult to pursue progressive policies. It seems to me that although neither of those norms were intended by the creators of the original MDGs, they were to a fair extent, at the very least, unchallenged by the MDGs. It strikes me as highly unlikely that the post-2015 framework will not challenge both of them, more or less directly. And that doesn't mean we should relax and it's all going to be okay, but I think things have moved on and a lot of the change in thinking will be seen in the new framework, but they're both definitely areas that we should keep pushing very hard on. The question around persons with disabilities and whether specific groups get lost when we try to generalize about vulnerable groups, I think that's an enormously important question. It's one that much more sensible people than me have spent a lot of time thinking about. I don't think there is a perfect answer, because I think somebody would have come up with it by now. But what I think we can do, and this is one area that is very clear in the report, and perhaps we should emphasize a little more, is invest in the data. One thing I heard the other week that really shocked me is that some of the major household surveys that are being done, rolled out across countries, have apparently stopped looking at persons with disabilities because it's felt that they don't get data that's representative and therefore it's easier and cheaper not to bother at all. It should be absolutely clear that that's unacceptable, and the post-2015 framework needs exactly the kind of specificity that even if there aren't specific targets on, let's say, the relative outcomes in groups of one sort and another, that there has to be an absolute assumption that the target would be equality between the outcomes of those groups at a minimum. And I think by making sure that that data is there on each dimension of inequality within each outcome, we get a long way down the road to setting that norm. Just finally, on the question of tax, a wonderful question from the wonderful Ibis. The potential to explicitly address illicit flows within the framework. I'm not sure, partly because the data we have on illicit flows is almost by definition not perfect. It's difficult to see how you construct a good indicator. But I think what you are seeing is increasing numbers of organizations and people calling for some of the outcomes that would be affected by illicit flows to be included. So in particular, ratios of tax to GDP, ratios of direct tax to indirect tax, that's some kind of measure of whether the state has the power to conduct progressive taxation on wealth, incomes, profits. And I think that might be the place where both politically it's more straightforward to get consensus, but also we can come up with indicators that are more clearly measuring what we're actually concerned with.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Bethany, can I ask you to give us 5 questions from the online, from the feed?
question from Indonesia, from Astrida Fitri. She says, how has diversity-based inequality, i.e. inequalities based on gender, race, religion, etc., been addressed in Islamic countries so far? Huchi Go from India says, how can market economies, market forces be reformed so that they address rather than create and exacerbate inequalities? Also via Twitter, Sarah Shaw asks, if recognition of sexual and reproductive health and rights is part of the framework to measure inequality, how will it be measured? From Uruguay, Marcela Balera, also via Twitter, says, will access to learning, including literacy, for the most marginalized women, be included as a cross-cutting theme in the post-2015 framework? And the last question from Matthew Lindley in the UK, he says, when 1 in 10 babies are born to girl mothers, how will panelists work to tackle inequalities for women and girls?
Who among the panelists would like to answer one or more of these? That's it.
I just wanted to address myself to the question of how markets can be reformed to begin to address inequalities instead of exacerbate them. I think the whole post-global financial crisis world has come with a strong recognition that markets do not address the most challenging problems of inequality around the globe and in our societies. And I think this recognition is a start, and it is something we should work on, because there are many other institutions. The state has a great role to play in tackling inequalities, focusing on social policies, focusing on non-market processes and transactions. I think it's very critical. What happened in the 80s and the 90s is that we began to forget these other institutions and structures and focus too much on market reforms. Even our social policies were underpinned by market reforms. And I think this process is a chance to move away from our sole reliance on the market and begin to see the ways in which all these other non-market institutions can begin to play their role in a stronger agenda.
Anyone else? Nico? Yeah.
I would like to say a comment that it's related to even the education and the sexual and reproductive rights services, how to measure. For me, it's really important in this framework that we don't get caught by the quantitative approach to measure everything. There are many things that it's very difficult to measure, and there are many important things that we need to measure from a different perspective. When we're talking about gender equality or empowerment, it's really difficult to include it in this quantitative way. So when we are measuring, we need to discuss which are the qualitative indicators that shows how sexual and reproductive rights services or how quality education is challenging the cultural norms and discrimination, and say how these services are not just provisioning contraceptives, for instance, but are really able to tackle with people who are educated for that, to tackle discrimination, address gender-based violence, specific strategies for adolescents and girls on their sexual and reproductive rights. And so we need to think also that in order to achieve universal access, we need specific strategies to overcome the intersecting inequalities. So this is related not just about girls' rights to sexual and reproductive, but also disability people, and how all these identities are intersected, and how the social services that should put in place should really have a transformative way of it's a new way of doing policy. We're used to have this silo approach where you have HIV programs and then sexual and reproductive rights programs, and even with education, it's the same. We have very separate way of thinking, like sexual education or education in human rights, and we really need, because people are intersection of different identities, and we need to have a comprehensive approach. We need to change the way policies are implemented and impacts are measured, including qualitative information.
Thank you. I think we will go to our last two speakers now, because in their presentations also they may be able to respond to some of these questions and some of the earlier questions. So, Christina, can I give you the floor first? Christina Chang is from the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, 2015.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm actually here representing Beyond 2015, and I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't already, to look at their position paper, which has 7 recommendations for implementing inequality within a framework incorporating. And I just wanted to sum up a little bit. I've been taking notes during a very interesting discussion, and thank you to everybody for your inputs. A little bit, some of the messages that I've heard around inequality and the reasons why we should tackle inequality, which is the subject of the panel. And I would say there are sort of 3 generic reasons and 2 specific ones for this framework, I think. So the 3 generic ones I would call the 3 E's, which are sort of ethical. We've heard a lot about, and it's in the report about people being born equal in rights, but not being born equal really in anything else, either opportunities or outcomes. The second would be effectiveness, and I think this is really what we were talking about, particularly in the early presentations, about why the original Millennium Declaration failed to tackle these issues, which is inequality was only included in a political rather than very practical sense. And this meant that inequality remained a barrier to achieving those other goals, social, human, environmental. Really, inequality was a stumbling block to achieving those. And the final one, which we didn't hear so much about, would be efficiency, and I relate this to sustainability. In societies that are very unequal, it's very difficult for us to tackle the problems of poverty eradication in a sustainable way, and particularly to tackle the barriers that are facing most marginalized groups in society. We will simply sort of need more resources, more growth, more efforts in order to reach those groups if we have massively unequal societies. By focusing on the groups that are most marginalized, we have much more chance of achieving the goals that we've set for ourselves. So then turning to the 2 reasons that it could be included in the framework, that it's important that it's included in the framework. And one we've heard particularly a lot about is that it means that we have to tackle those systemic and structural problems. You can't tackle inequality without tackling unfair trade rules, unfair taxation systems, the lack of accountability of corporations, among other things. And I just wanted to give you an example of how far away we are from achieving that. We've talked a lot about the unrealized potential of most of the groups that are facing inequality and how they don't get to contribute to society. But still, the advice that we give to governments really doesn't encourage them to target those groups. At CAFOD, we work a lot on sort of small, informal, poor enterprises who make up sort of 90% of the jobs and 50% of GDP in a lot of countries. But still, the advice given to governments in their economic policy doesn't target these groups. It's really about sort of building ports rather than rural feeder roads, and that's something that we really need to rethink if we're going to tackle inequality. And the second reason it should be in a framework is a more positive one. I think we've heard a lot about how inequalities are mutually reinforcing and they perpetuate themselves, but I think the corollary of that is also true. If we tackle inequality in a meaningful way, then it pays multiple dividends. And I think one of the good examples of this is where the social protection floor has been implemented, or social protection more generally has been implemented, which really gets to giving people their rights, tackling the sort of the realizations of people's rights. And we see that then tackles both vertical, general inequalities and the inequalities of specific groups. It tends to benefit those specific groups in particular. and we see it having economic, social, changes power relations, and it's that kind of dynamic that we can get if we tackle inequality in a framework. And I guess the final thing I would say, one of the reasons, the more pragmatic one, is that it's quite feasible to have a goal in inequality. We can track specific commitments that governments make. We can see if they're fulfilling their human rights obligations. We can see if they're implementing a social protection floor, for example, that has good coverage. And as Alex and others have mentioned, although we don't have perfect data, we can improve on the data that we have. We can include qualitative indicators, and it's not a reason we don't start with what we can measure. We start with what we want to achieve.
Thank you very much. Can we go to our last speaker, to Rosa Lizarde from the Feminist Task Force of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Rosa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank Saras and Richard and all the members of UN Women and UNICEF who have contributed to making this advisory group a very engaged, very successful process and group of individuals who have really been working together over these past months. So I just want to highlight a few points. I mean, this report is very comprehensive, and the consultations also have been very comprehensive. But just to highlight a few points that I think can also be taken into account as the day progresses. And one of those points is to highlight the interlinkages of inequality. And in particular, the interconnectedness of gender inequality within this discussion. The report finds that multiple inequalities tend to affect some people disproportionately, and we heard several speakers today mention that, how it affects the impoverished, the socially excluded, the disabled, minorities, so-called marginalized, and the majority of whom are women. And the report also highlights how inequalities result from structural barriers, economic, social, environmental, and political, and how these barriers are mutually reinforcing. And in particular, I'd like to highlight, and the Feminist Task Force posed, that gender inequality be added as one of these structural barriers, and be seen as central in this discussion. It leads me to my next point, which is that that gender inequality, therefore, not be lost or subsumed within the larger discussion of inequality. And in particular, I want to highlight findings from the e-discussion on gender equality, of which I was a co-moderator, also Nicole, and a couple of other colleagues from civil society. And I raise this as a point not to be lost, and I know it was mentioned earlier by Saras, but the #1 priority for the participants in this e-discussion, which took place in late October, November, was combating all forms of gender-based violence. And this is one of the points that I think should not be lost within this discussion, because it's a priority of women. Certainly we're going to be seeing more of this in the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women at the UN, which has as its theme eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls. This issue was one of the most widely voiced issues, with nearly 4 in 10 comments received in the first week, making at least one reference to gender-based violence, or violence against women and girls specifically. So within the different socially excluded minorities, we see this issue as coming up again and again. I also want to highlight the inequality of access and opportunity. We all are very fortunate, and thank you to the sponsoring government of Denmark and Ghana to be here today, and for those of us who are online who are able to connect in that way. But I want to stress that we should continue to be inclusive in this discussion and reach out to those who are not as fortunate as we are, and to continue to raise those issues into this dialogue. I think that, as Richard said, this should be seen as a beginning, and this report should be seen as a living document. And I think later on we're going to meet and see how we can take this forward. But I think that stressing the fact that not all the voices of those impacted by inequality and poverty and discrimination are included in this discussion. And these voices are vital in the post-2015 development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor for 2 more questions from the room, and then maybe 2 more questions online. We have more, Bethany? So let's start with the online questions, and then we can take as many as we have time for. Bethany, do you want to give us 2 or 3 interesting ones?
So Kumar Manish in India says, why is there an inequality in accessing public?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Why is there an inequality in accessing public information on government projects? Why not make it free and available? Finuna Murphy from the International HIV/AIDS Alliance says, the Monrovia communique from the high-level panel emphasizes that economic growth is not sufficient to ensure social justice and equity. Do you think the panel will take up the inequalities recommendations on a standalone goal on inequality? And Isabel Fatimani from the UK says, what is the relationship between poverty and inequality in international development, and how can they be tackled together sustainably? Finally, Fran Luke from the US says, are the inequalities faced by gender non-conforming people included in these discussions of gender equality, and can they be assigned a special rapporteur?
Thank you. Who would like to ask a question from the floor? Or a comment? Please.
Summing up here is that we have the MDG achievements, but what we
Thank you. Anybody else? Please.
I am representing a global campaign for education, and thank you very much for the report. My question to you is for the panel to think of inequality towards education. I know you received the report about the key to equality would be early childhood development. The investments in education and the inequality in the different countries, how do you see this, and how do you see this in the common goals? I think the minister, he actually said something about the toy and the boy who could become an engineer if his opportunities had been different. How do you see us actually looking at inequality and actually tackling it, and what is the role of education playing? Thank you.
A last question? No. Yes.
My name is Kirsten from ActionAid Denmark. Christina, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that actually economic policies don't seem to hit the large majority of people suffering from inequalities. And I think if we're to fight inequality, I think we have to make sure that we make some of the invisible visible. ActionAid just published a report on unpaid care work called Making Care Visible. So my question is, how do we make sure that targets and indicators actually make sure that the current trend that we're seeing, where tax deals, agribusiness, global economic policies can come in and actually maybe focus on the status quo, focus on benefiting certain groups of society in society that seem to benefit from the current inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to the panel now.
I think several of the comments that have just been made actually speak to the role of social policy in tackling inequalities. Over the past 30 years, social policy has become a poor cousin to economic policies. If we now recognize that economic policies and growth are not the whole picture, I think it means that we've agreed to put social policy at the center of the post-MDGs agenda. And social policy, we must remember, has many roles. It's supposed to be supporting productive and reproductive activities. It's supposed to be protecting those who are not able to cope. It's supposed to be redistributing the wealth of society, and it's supposed to be building social cohesion. So if we take all these aims of social policy seriously, then social policy is not simply about subsidies or about charity and so on. It becomes an investment in development and in ensuring that all of us move forward when society moves forward. And in thinking about social policy, I want to emphasize the role of education, and I think the point has been made that education is a very important aspect of building the capacities of people and also ensuring that they participate fully in society. But I also want to draw attention to health and to housing, and last but not the least, to employment, that these need to become very clear goals, and our report refers very clearly to these issues, and I'm happy that they've been emphasized in this round of discussions. Thank you.
If I may follow up, I totally agree with you, Tsotsi. I think social policies are very important in this context. And it's true that the free market may produce inequalities, but I think on the other hand, we should be a little bit careful to say that the market as such is the problem. Denmark actually experienced reduced inequalities from the 1950s to 1980s. And that was with a market economy, but with strong political interventions in how the market should be organized and in the social sectors. So it's certainly possible. however, since the 1990s, inequalities have increased in Denmark, and that's also due to policies made by politicians, as the development minister also emphasized. So for me, that's the point. Political will can do something about this, and we don't have to necessarily to dismantle the market as such. The second thing I would like to say is this about the simplicity of the future development goals. How can we actually achieve this? I think and a very important thing that we have emphasized in our group is that it is important to disaggregate other goals and indicators and look upon them from a perspective of inequality. And that will make a huge difference. But then, of course, it would also be very important for the public discussion in general if there is a standalone goal. And how that could be organized, I think, and one which will focus on the Gini coefficient would be very interesting, but also politically very difficult to get through. But on the other hand, something on the economy would be necessary, I think, if we look into, if we accept that or recognize the economic disparities globally. But that's not the only thing. So how to combine that perspective with the clear point that different categories of people, different social groups experience difficulties and barriers, structural barriers that others don't. That has to be combined to some in one way or another. So far, I haven't come up with the conclusion of that point, unfortunately.
Thank you. Anybody else? Nicola?
Regarding the question of education, I think it's very important, and there are a lot of studies showing how education and access to education can be, it's a very social mobilizer in many societies. But this is also a challenge about how we create and we implement policy from a comprehensive approach, because also we have some studies showing that women access to education don't automatically finish, in the women access to labor market. Because why? Because there are structural discrimination in the labor market that implies that women, even if they have the same education, they do not access to the same position or wage or salaries. So I think we should go beyond access to education. We need to think about the quality of education and also how education can reproduce inequalities. So that's, I think it's very important if we move from the basis of the agendas of the UN conference in the 90s and we push a little bit harder, saying about what kind of education. We want an education that really transforms and create citizens that are really critical and able to engage and change the economic structures. And so I think we should move from the access to the quality, and to ensure that we need to discuss the issue of the role of state and the role of who will finance the social development goals and the human right of the access to human right of people. And we need strong states, but also reform states, not the same state that we claimed 20 years ago. And this is really a threat in a moment where private financing is very on the top, and we have many new philanthropies that have much more money for development than even our countries in the south. So, and even we have seen this debate in Rio+20, where the discussion was about, well, how we're going to implement this agenda. And instead of talking about public financing, many governments pushing the private and public partnership type of financing. And we know the risk of these initiatives, and we already have seen this in the carbon trade markets, and how sometimes they are talking that it's good for people, but when you really are analyzing the programs that are put in place, it's just new access for new markets for some enterprises in water, even in education. So we need to discuss about the role of state and how we increase public financing. So the question on taxation is still really relevant.
Thank you. I'm going to give Alex and Christina 1 minute each, because we don't want to eat into your coffee break, and then Richard will have the final word. Please.
Thank you. I just want to pick up the point about the communicability of the MDGs and of an inequality goal. Actually, I think we kid ourselves a bit about how easily communicable the MDGs are. We all remember that MDG 1 is about extreme poverty, and that's probably the best communicated part. But actually, we forget MDG 1 is also about ending hunger, is also about decent work for all, also includes indicators about the income share of different groups. That gets lost in the communication. I think we probably, as a sector globally, are capable of communicating an inequality goal well. So I don't want to get too hung up on that. On the other hand, I think the Gini coefficient is the enemy of communication. I think nobody really understands it terribly well, including people who use it a lot. And it's clear that it's possible for the poorest part of the income distribution to reduce their share of national income and the Gini not to move. This is not a good measure of inequality. For which reason in the report there's a discussion of taking instead a ratio of the top 10% to the bottom 40%. And I think that's a productive avenue to pursue. It also allows perhaps more easily for people to understand, if you're looking at ratios between groups, the way that that type of economic inequality aligns with gender inequality, with inequality between other groups, persons with disabilities and so on. So I think there's room to communicate that better.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be really short because I'm addicted to coffee. But there were a lot of questions that seemed to be about how do we structure a goal, how do we communicate it, how do we measure it, and I don't have the answer. But I think there's two things that we're trying to do, and maybe it's useful to think about those to break the task down a little bit. The first one, I think we're trying to provide people, everybody, with the basic conditions to contribute to society and to the economies, whether it's educational, health, assets. And the second is we're trying to create an environment in which those people can flourish and can contribute, whether that's economic, social, or political. So breaking it down into those two, I think, is quite a useful way of looking at what we're going to measure. And obviously there we would measure two kinds of things. One would be the commitments that states make in order to provide that environment. And the other would be perhaps to measure the outcomes, to measure sort of how we're doing on access to education, quality to education, for example.
Thanks. This has been a really interesting session. And I want to make three observations at the end, or react to three things. Firstly, I'm equally hung up on coffee, but I think we must not be overly hung up on goals, targets, and indicators. There's not the totality of the new framework that we need. In my view, part of where things have gone wrong in the past 12 years is that we forgot that the Millennium Declaration is the framework. And we started thinking that this is all about reaching goals, targets, and indicators. And the point that was made before about the need to reinforce the normative framework for all that we do in development, reaching goals, they need to be guided by and rooted in international norms and values. And that's what the Millennium Declaration provides. So I think when we're talking about the next framework, by all means, let's debate about what are the headline goals and priorities and how they can be translated into targets, how indicators can be used. But let's not forget that's not the totality of the whole thing. We are talking about norms that underpin all of this and normative provisions that commit governments and other actors in the process to doing things in a certain way, in a way that's consistent with and reflective of international human rights standards. So that would be the first point. And I think that as part of this, there should be a series of litmus tests, if you like, so a series of commitments about actions, just in the way Tina was saying. That certain policies should be in place to ensure basic livelihoods through social protection. Legislation should be in place that prevents discrimination on the grounds of disability, ethnicity, gender, etc. So we need not only programs to reach goals, we also need provisions and commitments through laws and regulations that limit harmful behavior of people and corporations to those who are worst off. We need those litmus tests as well embedded in the framework. Secondly, I think what we've heard from a number of interventions and questions is that the nature of exclusion, discrimination, marginalization varies from one society to another. There's no blueprint that applies and will be relevant to all societies or even any single one. So that implies to me that part of the commitment to a new agenda should be that every country, on an ongoing basis, seeks to understand the situation of those who are worst off, those who are most marginalized and affected by inequalities, and does that in a public way. It's, sure, academic studies, research, social, cultural, and anthropological field research come in, but that should be part of a public discussion of who is worst off in our society, why are they worst off and excluded, and what should be done about it. And that should be ongoing and a project of the whole society, not only of experts or governments who keep the data to themselves very often and not transparent. It's what we call in UNICEF a situation analysis, and that can be applied to poverty, inequalities. It looks not only at what's happening, but why. Who are the worst off, but why are they worst off? And then that leads to policy interventions. And the third comment I want to make is on data. And I fully agree, I think it was Alex that discussed this. If there are no data on, around or about the lives of certain groups, that in itself is an expression of neglect, of the unwillingness of political and policy decision makers to seek to understand the situation of a particular group. Another example, as well as persons with disabilities, is the example that Asefa gave of children without adequate parental care. Most household surveys, and I think others have pointed this out, do not cover children living on the street or adults living on the street, homelessness, people living in slum conditions who don't have fixed addresses. They're not often included in census, they're not included in household sample surveys. But the fact that they are not included does not mean that efforts cannot be made to understand the situation of people in those circumstances. That's a political decision about priorities to understand. Linked to that, the mere fact that we don't have data right now about certain groups, it can't be an excuse for not dealing with their situation. Oh, we don't have data on persons with disabilities, therefore we can't XXX. It can't be used as an excuse, because actually it's our choice that we have not sought to collect information or understand that situation. And that leads to my final comment, which if we don't have data, let's go and ask people. Let's go and sit with them and listen, hear their stories, understand their situation from their own experiences, from out of their own mouths. If we haven't done that, we can't get away with saying we don't know their situation, because we haven't taken the trouble to go and sit down together with them and listen. So we need to do that.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'm not going to prolong this session. It's been an excellent round and a good start to our discussions today. I think we have 15 minutes for a coffee break, and please come back after 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists.
Thank you all.